أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على المصطفى محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم واللعنة الدائمة على أعدائهم أجمعين إلى قيام يوم الدين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي اللهم كن لوليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوى وتمتعه فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. Alright, so this is our first lesson regarding Islamic laws for this year. In fact, it's been a few years since we've had a formal class regarding Islamic laws. Seeing that, inshallah, we're going to be giving these classes for 2 months, and then we're going to stop during the month of Ramadan. So we have 8 classes of fiqh. We're not able to cover several chapters of fiqh. Hence, I chose to speak about the laws regarding a very important chapter that we all need to learn. And that is the chapter of khalal, al-khalal fi salat. The chapter which mentions the errors or mistakes done by a person in salat. Why is this a very important chapter? Because sometimes when you perform a mistake in salat, you have to repeat the salat. The salat becomes void and you have to repeat it. And in some cases, the salat is not void, it's valid. However, you have to do something to compensate for the mistake. And sometimes the salat is valid, it's not void, and you don't have to do anything. The Sharia tells you, just continue your salat and finish it, and we exempt you from performing an extra deed to compensate for the mistake that you did in your prayer. That being said, it's very important for us to know the specifics, the detailed laws regarding making mistakes or making errors in salat to ensure that our salawat are valid. So we're going to start today. Possibly we'll finish 2 verdicts that Sayyid al-Sistani Damadullah mentions in his book Minhaj al-Salihin. Now, other fuqaha, other jurists will definitely agree with Sayyid Sistani on a significant amount of verdicts that he mentions, but at the same time they might differ with him on certain verdicts that he mentions. So, if I mention the opinion of other maraja, I will mention that to you. I'll tell you other maraja or this specific marja says X, Y, and Z. If I don't do that, then consider that what I'm saying coincides with the verdicts of Sayyid al-Sistani, Damadullah. So he says in the chapter of Khalal, al-Khalal fi salat, he states, من أخل بشيء من أجزاء الصلاة وشرائطها عمدا بطلت صلاته. He says if a person makes a mistake in salat, as in he does not perform a specific part of salat willfully the way it's supposed to be performed, or he does not uphold one of the conditions of salat willfully, then in both cases his prayer will be void. Here we need to understand that there are things we call ajza' as-salat, the parts of the prayer. And then there are things we call shara'it as-salat, the conditions of the prayer, or call them the conditions of the validity of the prayer. Let's start with the first category. أجزاء الصلاة, the parts of the prayer. Here we're talking about what? We're talking about the components of the prayer, like takbiratul ihram, the first takbirah, which is the opening takbirah that brings you into the prayer. Allahu Akbar. Like al-qira'ah, reading Surah Al-Fatiha and another surah after it. Or reading التسبيحات الأربع in the third or fourth rak'ah of your prayer. Those are what? Those are examples of parts of the prayer. Other examples are ruku', when you bow down in prayer. Qiyam, after ruku', when you stand up after the ruku'. Sujud, 2 sajdas. Each sajda is part of your prayer. Tashahhud, taslim. These are what? The components of the prayer. So if someone willfully, okay, intentionally, comes and, plays around with his salat, he does not perform a specific mandatory part of the prayer the way it's supposed to be performed intentionally, then his prayer is void. For example, I begin Salat al-Dhuhr. Okay, I'm going to give a lot of examples in these lessons because I believe one of the best ways to clarify Islamic jurisprudence is giving examples. So I begin my Salat al-Dhuhr, Allahu Akbar. I read Surah Al-Fatiha. By the end of Surah Al-Fatiha, I think, you know what? I've prayed for a long time. I've done many salawat. Today I'm going to take a break. Now I'm not going to read the surah after Surah Al-Fatiha. I'll just go into ruku'. And Allah Ta'ala will accept, right? So I stop at Surah Al-Fatiha, I stop at Waladdaleen, Allahu Akbar, and I go into ruku'. Here Sayyid Stan tells me what? Tells me your salat is void, it's invalid. Why, Sayyidina? Well, because you intentionally refrained from reading the surah after Surah Al-Fatiha, and you went into ruku'. So your prayer is what? Invalid. That's one example. Another example. A person begins a salat and he goes into ruku'. He does the ruku'. He does it. But when you go into ruku', you're supposed to be in a state of itma'nan, meaning you have to be still, right? Minimal movements are not a problem. If you perform a minimal movement, it won't break the ruku'. But significant movements are a problem. So you have to be still in the ruku', right? You have to be still. Someone comes into ruku'. Now, we should be still to what extent? The least you should do is you go into ruku' and you remain still. Then you say, Subhana Rabbi al-Azimi wa bihamdeh. Once you say wa bihamdeh, once you finish that word, you can get up from ruku'. Here, your ruku' will be A-okay. Someone says, you know what? I don't have time for this. I'm going to recite the dhikr as I'm moving, intentionally. So as he's going down to ruku', okay? He's going down, he says, Subhana Rabbil Azim wa bihamdih, and then he goes back up. So he remains in ruku' for maybe a second or two. And he's not still when he's reading the dhikr. Because he's doing this intentionally, what happens? His salat is void. His salat is batil. If this is clear, now we go to the shara'it. The shara'it. Sayyid Damadullah said, you also have to preserve and uphold the conditions of the validity of the prayer. If you play around with the conditions and you don't uphold some conditions intentionally, your salat will be invalid. What are some conditions of salat, conditions of the validity of prayer. For example, one of them is what we were mentioning in our class earlier, facing the Qibla. That is a shart. Would you call facing the Qibla juzu? It's part of the prayer? No, it's not a part, it's not a component of the prayer, but it's a condition. When you're praying, Allah Ta'ala wants you to face what? Al-Kaaba. To face Al-Kaaba. فَوَلُّوا وُجُوهَكُمْ شطر المسجد الحرام, right? We just read the verse. وحيثما كنتم فولوا وجوهكم شطره, meaning شطر المسجد الحرام. Another condition is wudu. When you are praying, Allah Ta'ala wants you to be on wudu. Correct? He wants you to have what we call tahara min al-hadath. Purity from, he wants you to have spiritual purity. Spiritual purity. Yes, in some cases, you're going to do a ritual bath, a ghusl, and the ghusl will exempt you from wudu, like ghusl al-janaba. Or ghusl al-hayd, according to Sayyid Sistani Damadullah, ghusl al-hayd also exempts a lady from wudu. So having that spiritual purity is necessary. If you don't have water, right? If you don't have water, you can't do ghusl or you can't do wudu, depending on which of the two you have to do. Then you go to what? To tayammum. Tayammum will give you the spiritual purity we're talking about. That is necessary for salat. It's a condition. So if someone says, you know what, I've done many salawat in my life. I always do wudu. Alright? Khalas. Today I'll pray without wudu and Allah Ta'ala will accept it. No, He won't accept it. You need to perform wudu before you pray. Another condition is the purity of the body and the purity of the clothes. Okay? The body has to be pure and our clothes have to be pure as well. Yes, there are exceptions, and hopefully one day we can study those exceptions. There are exceptions. There are cases where you can have a najasa, something that's impure on you, and your prayer will still be valid. Your prayer will still be valid. But in general, the general ruling is what? Is that the body and the clothes of the person who's praying have to be pure. So if someone, uses the washroom, ajallakumullah, and he doesn't purify himself, and then he goes to pray, intentionally, he's doing this intentionally, his salat is what? His salat is invalid. He's able to purify himself, he doesn't do so out of laziness, intentionally, and he goes to pray, his prayer will be invalid. This is what Sayyid is mentioning when he says, we'll read the statement again, من أخل بشيء من أجزاء الصلاة وشرائطها عمدا بطلت صلاته ولو كان بحرف أو حركة من القراءة أو الذكر. He says, if you intentionally make a mistake in salat, such that you don't uphold one of the conditions of salat, or you don't perform one of the parts of the prayer correctly, your salat will be invalid, even if your mistake is as slight as changing what? Changing a letter. Again, we're talking about doing this intentionally. Or changing what we call a haraka, a vowel, in a Quranic verse, or a dhikr, an invocation. For example, someone prays, and we know in Salat you have to say in Surah Al-Fatiha, اهدنا الصراط المستقيم. For some reason, I'm not sure why, the person decides on removing the ra, and he says اهدنا الصراط المستقيم. In this case, his Salat is what? Invalid. Same goes with playing around with the vowels, الحركات. For example, Allah says مالك يوم الدين in Surah Al-Fatiha. I say, you know what? Today I'm gonna change the verse. مالك يوم الدين. No, that doesn't work. Number one, you're changing Quran, and number two, you're playing around with your salah. That doesn't work. It does not work. Same goes with the invocations. For example, in ruku' we say Subhana Rabbiyal Azimi wa bihamdih. Someone says, you know what, today I'm going to be creative, and I'm going to say Subhana Rabbiyal Azim wa bihamdah. Hamdah. It's bihamdih, not bihamdah, right? He does that intentionally. That will make his salat invalid. So what's the message that we derive from this verdict? The message is, don't play around with your salat. Salat is a serious matter. It's not a game. Then he says, وَكَذَا مَنْ زَادَ فِيهَا جُزْءًا عَمْدًا قَوْلًا أَوْ فِعْلًا مِنْ غَيْرِ فَرْقٍ. Actually, we'll read that one later. وَكَذَا مَنْ زَادَ فِيهَا جُزْءًا عَمْدًا قَوْلًا أَوْ فِعْلًا. He says the same applies if someone intentionally instills an additional part or an additional word to the prayer. So if you add something to your salat, you make up or present a new part into the salat intentionally, this will make your salat invalid. Now, this new part that you're presenting sometimes is a word. It's a word. And sometimes, no, it's an action. Meaning it's an action performed by, the body, not just the tongue. For example, let's start with the word. How many times do we perform takbirat al-ihram? Once, right? It's wajib to perform it once. Yes, it's mustahab, I'm not sure if you know this, but it's mustahab to do 7 takbirat when you pray. 7 takbirat. And the best way to go about this, is to intend that the 7th takbirah is takbirat al-ihram. Alright? But suppose someone does takbirat al-ihram. He does it, Allahu Akbar. His salat has begun, right? Now he says, you know what? I want to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I'm going to do a 2nd takbirat al-ihram. He says, Allahu Akbar. Here we tell him, you're not getting closer to Allah Azza wa Jal. You're making up your own rules. If you want to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you should obey Him the way He wants to be obeyed. By adding that 2nd takbirat al-ihram, you've made your salat invalid because you intentionally did that. واضح? You intentionally did that. So if someone adds a takbirat al-ihram sahwan, out of unawareness, a 2nd time, is that okay? We'll get to that. We can get to that later. I'm not saying that right now. I'm not saying yes or no. We can get to that hukum. But for now, we should know if you add a takbirat al-ihram, a 2nd takbirat al-ihram, intentionally, your salat is void without doubt. As for the fa'al, the action, an example of that is someone who does 3 sajdas he prostrates 3 times in 1 rak'ah. We know each rak'ah has 2 sajdas. Someone performs salat and he says, you know what, today I want to get closer to Allah. I feel very spiritual. And so he does 3 sajdas instead of 2, intentionally. Or someone says, you know what, I really like Salat al-Ayat. I love it. In Salat al-Ayat, you have 5 ruku'as in each rak'ah. So he says, I'm going to do the same in Salat al-Dhuhr. I'm going to have 5 ruku'as in each rak'ah. So 20 ruku'as in Salat al-Dhuhr. By doing that, he is making his salat void, invalid. Then as-Sayyid says, من غير فرق في ذلك كله بين الركن وغيره. He says, concerning the words we mentioned, the statements we mentioned, all of that applies to the parts of prayer that are arkan, pillars of prayer, and the parts that are not arkan, that are not pillars of prayer. So what does that mean? Well, let's understand what are the arkan. Can someone tell me what are arkan as-salat, the pillars of salat? Let me test your knowledge today.
The pillars of salat isn't the first one, the first takbir. Then you have to be in qiyamah.
Bravo.
Then you have to be in qiyamah. Then you have to go in ruku', then sujood, then then tasallum. No, then the
Taslim is
tashahhud.
wajib, but it's not a pillar.
Oh, okay.
You got 4, mashallah.
I'm
4 out
trying
of
to
5.
remember.
The 5th one is an-niyah, the intention.
Oh, yeah.
Right? An-niyah. That's what our jurists mention. So the 5 pillars of prayer are an-niyah, the intention. Because your prayer will not be a prayer, it will not be a salat if you don't have a niyyah, if you don't have an intention, if you're not intending on actually doing this worship for Allah Ta'ala to get closer to Allah Jalla Jalaluhu, then you're not worshipping God Azza wa Jal. So niyyah is number 1. Number 2, we have takbirat al-ihram, the opening takbirah. Number 3, we have qiyam. Which qiyam? This is an important point and I want you to focus with me. We have 4 types of qiyam. Qiyam means to basically stand up. So we have 4 types of qiyam in the prayer. 2 of which are arkan. And the other 2 are wajib, but they're not arkan. So, when you perform takbirat al-ihram, you have to be standing. You need to do it when you're standing. That is what? Wajib rukni. It's mandatory and it's a pillar. When you read Surah Al-Fatiha and the other surah, or you read the Tasbihat al-Arba in the 3rd or 4th rak'ah, you also have to be standing up. But this is what? Wajib ghayr rukni. It's wajib, it's mandatory, but it's not a pillar. It's not a pillar? Yes, it's not a pillar. It's a pillar, qiyam is a pillar when you're doing takbirat al-ihram. When you're reading the 2 surahs, it's wajib, but it's not a rukn, it's not a pillar. When you finish reading the 2 chapters or التسبيحات الأربع and you want to go into ruku', this is a 3rd qiyam. This qiyam is rukni, it's a pillar. So when you go into ruku', you have to be standing up before that. When you finish ruku', you get up from the ruku', right? You stand up. That qiyam is wajib غير rukni. It's not a pillar. That qiyam is mandatory, but it's not a pillar. Let me repeat, because we're giving a good amount of information. Okay? We have 4 types of qiyam. 2 are arkan, and 2 are not. The 2 that are rukni, wajib rukni, meaning it's mandatory and it's a pillar, are the qiyam during takbirat al-ihram and the qiyam right before ruku', when you finish reading whatever you were reading in your first, second, third, or fourth rak'ah. The 2 other qiyams that are mandatory but they're not pillars are standing up when you're reading the 2 chapters or reading at tasbihat al-arba, and standing up after ruku'. These are wajib, but they're not pillars.
I have a question.
Yes.
Can you explain what do you mean by qiyam? Is when you like you're standing, you want to go down? That's what you mean?
Exactly.
I just want to make sure.
Is standing up, right, on your 2 feet. In normal cases, you're not going to be leaning on anything. You're not going to be using anything to support yourself other than your own 2 feet. Now, we do have ahkam for cases of necessity, but those can be studied later on. However, if someone is healthy, he's able to stand up by himself, and he wants to do qiyam, then he has to stand on both feet, right? And should not be using anything to support himself other than his 2 feet. واضح, sister? Is it clear?
Yes, thank you.
أحسنتم. So, going back to the arkan, to the pillars, we said Niyya is a pillar, Takbirat al-Ihram is a pillar, Qiyam is a pillar. Now you know that when we say Qiyam, we're actually talking about 2 types of Qiyam. Okay, keep that in mind. Ruku', bowing down, is a pillar. And last but not least, sujood. Sujood, which is the heart of the prayer. The heart of our salat is sujood. But what's a pillar from sujood are the 2 sajdas. So both prostrations that are part of 1 rik'ah are the pillar of that rik'ah, or a pillar in that rik'ah. 1 sajda on its own is not a pillar. So again, the pillar is what? When we say sujood is a pillar, we're talking about the 2 sajdas of the same rik'ah, the same unit. Alright, now we've understood the pillars. And we've understood that there are obligations in the prayer that are not pillars, like tashahhud, like taslim, like qira'ah, reading the Surah Al-Fatiha and the surah after it. They're obligations, which means you have to do them, and you can't intentionally not do them, or else your salat will be what? Will be void. But they're not arkan. So what? What if they're not arkan? Khair, inshallah. Why are you making things complicated? We're not making things complicated. The thing is, the ahkam will differ sometimes. The reason why we need to know the pillars and the obligations that are not pillars is that the ahkam, the rulings sometimes will differ. So you'll make a mistake in salat and you'll be asked, okay, where was this mistake made? Was it made in a pillar or an obligation that's not a pillar? And depending on the answer, the outcome will be different sometimes. That's why we're mentioning the pillars and the obligations that are not pillars. So, going back to the statement of Sayyid al-Sistani Dhammadullah. He says, من غير فرق في ذلك كله بين الركن وغيره. So he's telling you, remember when I told you that if a person willfully does not perform a part of salat the way it should be performed, or willfully does not uphold one of the conditions of the validity of the prayer, and when I told you that if someone instills an additional part to the prayer, whether that's a qawl, it's a statement, or it's a fa'al, it's an action done by him. In all of these cases, when he's doing this intentionally, his prayer will be void. He says here, there is no difference between arkan and obligations that are not arkan. So a person who chooses to willfully not recite Surah Al-Fatiha in his salat, although reciting Surah Al-Fatiha is not a rukn, his salat will be invalid. Similarly, a person who chooses to willfully not perform ruku' in his salat will be what? Will be void. In both cases, the salat will be void. Although the first person chose to refrain from an obligation that's not a rukn, and the second one chose to refrain from an obligation that is a rukn. Finally, he says, ولا بين أن يكون ناويا ذلك في الابتداء أو في الأثناء. He says, whatever we mentioned in regards to, not performing certain parts of the prayer the way they're supposed to be performed, or adding certain parts to the prayer, or not upholding the certain conditions of the prayer. Here, he says, concerning those details, there is no difference. There is no difference whether the person intended on doing so from the beginning of the prayer, or he intended on doing so during the prayer, after he had started the salah. Let me give you two clear examples so we can finish for today, inshallah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Someone begins his salat. Ibrahim comes and he's about to pray Salat al-Asr. From the beginning, before he says Allahu Akbar, Ibrahim has a plan. Today, I will pray my salat without ruku'. I'll do everything else. From the beginning, that was his intention. Alright? And he carries out his plan. His salat is what? Void. Void. Then you have Musa, who comes to pray Salat al-Maghrib. From the beginning, Musa intends that I'm going to perform 3 ruku's in every rak'ah. And he actually carries out his plan. His salat is what? Void. Then you have Ibrahim again. This time he doesn't have that intention of, not doing ruku' in the prayer from the beginning. So he begins Salat al-Subh, for example, and he performs the first rak'ah perfectly. When he goes up for the second rak'ah, he thinks, what, I'm sleepy right now. I want to go back to sleep. I'll finish the salat quickly. I'll finish without doing ruku' in the second rak'ah. So here, this thought came to him when he was inside the salat. He did not have it from the beginning. In both cases, his salat is what? Void. When he commits that error in the prayer. or because he commits that error in the prayer. Musa, on the other hand, comes to pray Salat al-Dhuhr. Again, he prays it at the start. At the start of his Salat, he performs it perfectly, right? Takbirat al-Ihram, Qira'ah, Ruku', Qiyam, Sujood. Everything's perfect until he gets to the third rak'ah. In the third rak'ah, he says, you know what? I'm feeling very spiritual. Now I'm going to do 3 ruku's in the third rak'ah. So he does it, right? He did not have that thought from the beginning. It came to him during the salat. So does that make his salat invalid if he carries out the thought? Yes. This is what Sayyid Sistani is saying when he says, وَلَا بَيْنَ أَنْ يَكُونَ نَاوِيًا ذَلِكَ فِي الْإِبْتِدَاءِ أو في الأثناء. It does not make a difference. والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على المصطفى محمد وآله الطاهرين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم يا كريم.